Welcome to the Language Fuel podcast. Our mission is to fuel the teaching and learning of languages worldwide. I'm your host, Joanna Smith. Hello and welcome to episode number 8 of the Language Fuel podcast. Today I've got a treat for you. We are interviewing a man called Leon Butchers. Now Leon is the creator of some of the English as a second language or English as a foreign language games that we sell here at the Resource Room. He's based in Japan, from New Zealand originally, but has been in Japan for well over a dozen years. I can't remember exactly the number that it was. Now, what I really like about Leon's story, as you'll hear in a moment, is the fact that he saw a need and he started meeting the need. We didn't get quite to all the detail in the interview, but what I know about Leon is he went over and as many young people do who speak English fluently, they take advantage of opportunities to travel and teach English. He received a tiny bit of initial training, but certainly not the level of training that many of us receive who are choosing to do this as a career. And he's quite overt that initially it wasn't going to be a career for him. Nevertheless, he really enjoyed it, and in particular, he learned about the power of games in the classroom. And most teachers will definitely agree with the fact that, gamifying your lessons is a fabulous way to keep students engaged. So he took the bull by the horns and he created his own games, and he's now commercialized it, and they're fantastic. They're sold all around the world. So I hope you enjoy this interview, and I'll see you soon. So today we are talking to Leon Butchers. Leon is based in Japan, although he is a New Zealander by birth. So welcome, Leon, to the podcast.
Hi, Joanna. Thank you.
Great to have you here. So you have got a few games that you've created and so on, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I guess I want to go back a little bit in your history. You live in Japan now, but you are a Kiwi. Can you tell us a little bit about the decision to go there? How long ago was that? Was it just an opportunistic decision, or had you been planning to move there? How does that sort of story work?
It's probably a bit of both. I came to Japan when I was in my early 20s. So I graduated from university. I had about a year of work experience under my belt, and I was looking to travel. I was thinking about going to Europe, and then one option was going to Japan. It was actually, at that time, it was very easy to get a job going to Korea, but to teach English. But I had an interest in Japan because when I was in high school, I'd spent a few years studying Japanese.
Right. Yep.
That was probably a sort of piqued my interest a little bit, and I sort of checked online, and the exchange rate was very favourable at the time. And I was like, well, okay.
That always helps the decision making, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I sort of found out that I could get a job teaching English from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. Monday to Friday, and that would give me what looked like at the time a lot of money by New Zealand standards. I think it was about 40 yen to the dollar at the time. Mm-hmm. So it was sort of 2.5 versus now when it's not quite so much in your favour. So I was sort of weighing that up, and I was thinking maybe if I spend 6 months here, it might be interesting. Mm-hmm. It's a good jumping point for Asia.
So 6 months.
That was the original goal, yeah, just go there for 6 months and see if I can hack it out. Funnily enough, I got here and I had a really good time, and I enjoyed it, and I liked being in another culture and learning about it, and that's kind of how it started. I didn't have a plan to become a teacher by any means. In fact, The thought of it was quite scary, to be honest, when I was back home.
Yep. It was an opportunity to be a teacher, and Japan was but for you it was really just about the travel and experiencing the world, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I was keen to do something different, and I didn't really know what I was going to do. And I think when you're in your early 20s and you've been living in New Zealand for most of your life, it seemed like a great idea to. Yep. I sort of applied for a job there and I got it, and then suddenly, next thing you know, there I was, and it was.
There you were. So you mentioned you had studied Japanese a little bit at high school. How would you have rated your Japanese language when you first arrived? Like, what could you hold a conversation, or how much had you learned?
Not very much. I passed the school certificate from memory, but I don't think I was a great student, to be perfectly honest. I found it hard going because I had to sit down and study and learn the words and things like that. But it certainly helped. I had an advantage compared to people that just jumped off the plane and didn't know any words. But I remember sort of early attempts at trying to communicate and realizing that in the several years since I'd stopped learning Japanese, I'd lost a lot. And also that there's a big difference between learning Japanese from a textbook where the teacher speaks mostly in English and then he gives you some Japanese words, but in actual fact, you're spending most of your time learning Japanese in an English-speaking environment. So I wasn't very fluent by any means.
Yeah. And how long has it been that you've been in Japan now?
I got there in 2002. And I've spent a couple of years away, so yeah, it's over 12 years now.
Yeah. And so how would you rate your Japanese language now that you live there? I mean, I'm assuming I know you're still doing some teaching, so you do have a portion of your life that's still English, but obviously you must have a huge amount that's Japanese.
Yeah, I'm embarrassed to say that my Japanese is not fluent by any means. I'm conversational. I can, everyday things I can get by. When I watch the TV, for example, I can tell what's going on, but there'll be lots of bits that I don't know. So everyone's probably thinking, how did that happen? And in Japan, teaching English, it's a bit of an English speaking bubble because in your job you speak English, you tend to socialize with other English teachers or people that are interested in learning English.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to just from day to day not require Japanese, except for perhaps when you go to the shops or if you have to ask for directions or something like that. But probably the biggest one is the writing system, the kanji.
Right. Yeah.
Obviously, there's 2,000 of them to learn. I think I probably know about maybe 500 or 600 of them. You can pick some of them up just by looking around and you just, you see the sign for exit. But actually, you have to really sit down and study them. And getting all 2,000 of them down is definitely still just a work in progress.
Sure, and from what I understand, I think, Japanese native speakers also, it's a really big deal to learn their writing system. I mean, we sometimes think that English spelling is terrible, but the kanji, I think, is a real challenge, no matter what your first language is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they spend a lot of time on it in class, and I mean, miraculously, they have a higher literacy rate than most Western countries. So despite the difficult writing system and the fact that they have to learn 3 alphabets, in fact, 4 counting the English alphabet. Yeah, they all managed to do it. So it's quite amazing.
Yeah, fabulous. I obviously know you as the creator of some of these wonderful games that we're stocking at the resource room, this phonics and question answer games. So I guess I'd like to hear your story behind, the creation of the games. What gave you the idea? Yeah, so just tell me a little bit about what you've done, the sort of story there.
Like I said, I didn't have a plan to become a career teacher, but I found that I enjoyed it, and I think one of the good parts about the job is that you get to speak to lots of people in their environment, and it's actually a good way to find out about sort of everyday life in the country that you're living in. And I started off teaching adults, and over time I gravitated more and more to teaching children, and I sort of found that the age I liked teaching best was elementary age kids, but I also like teaching junior high school and high school children as well. But
were these, if I just interrupt for a real quick second, were the different age groups all at the same language school where you were? Like, how were you able, I guess, to swap between different levels or different ages?
I think it really depends what job you get. First job I had, I was in the middle of Osaka City. So the first year, I don't think I taught a single kids lesson. It was all sort of business men and women that were obviously adults. By the time I got another job and I moved to Nara, which was basically a lot more in the country, and it's a lot more sort of traditional town with an old history and things like that. And when I was there, the bulk of my lessons were kids lessons. So I found myself, having to figure that one out.
Yep.
It was interesting. There's a real learning curve, but I mean, over time, in terms of how I develop my games, obviously you have to use materials. Yep. I started off having an idea of what I thought was being a good teacher, but over time, you develop skills. And one thing that I noticed was that kids wanted to play. When I spoke to more and more teachers, the thinking was, it's actually good if kids are playing because then they're having fun and they can actually learn a lot as well. So I became sort of interested in using more and more games in my class because, one, it was the kids were getting better results that way, and it was more fun for me as much as anything.
It's always good when the teacher's enjoying the time as well.
Yeah, exactly. Like I sort of came to the conclusion that you can play with children, and if you set it up right, they understand that they should be using English in English class. They shouldn't be speaking in Japanese or whatever their native languages. And that's actually a big challenge as a teacher. But I sort of found that if you create a space where part of the game is just using just English, then that's a sort of way to get them willingly using English. So that was sort of quite a big breakthrough for me. I sort of found out, like, if they speak Japanese, they lose a point, or they have to pick up a card or something like that. Then
Right.
suddenly instead of it me being them telling them off, they were quite happy to see their friends get punished, and they kind of go from the role of resenting being forced to speak in English to sort of policing it for other kids.
Yep.
You know what I mean? So,
Yep.
so that was kind of how it started, and I think a lot of teachers make their own materials. I mean, I had a few attempts at making games, but they were just things that I'd spent a few hours on when I had some spare time, and they weren't really very well developed concepts in hindsight. But I
That's
think
how you learn, isn't it? You have
yeah,
experiment
exactly.
with something and
Yeah,
you realize what doesn't work so that you know what does work.
exactly. Yeah, and then I think at one stage, actually, I suppose where my games came from, if I'm to go right back, it might have go back to Takapuna Grammar School where I went to high school.
Yep.
Yeah, I had a really good science teacher called Mr. Davis, and I think he's a principal somewhere in Auckland now. I haven't really been following, but he was a really good teacher, and he used to start his science lessons, his chemistry lessons, with a sort of 5-minute quick fire Q&A session, and
Like
he'd
a
sort
quick
of
revision of what had happened before or something like that.
yeah, he'd be sort of looking through our book and what we've been doing the last few chapters, and he'd be like, oh, what's the formula for sulfuric acid or whatever, and if you know, you'd sort of put your hand up, and the first person to put their hand up would get to answer, and if they were right, then they'd get kudos, and if they weren't, then we'd all sort of have a light-hearted laugh at them. And I remember, and it's a pretty basic exercise, but I remember that being fun, and then I found that worked as a teacher. To do a Q&A session at the start of each class and keep it fun. But then I was thinking about it, and I was like, well, the problem is that the kids are only answering the questions. So how do I get them to ask the questions? And I mean, that sort of stumped me for a bit, because I was like, okay, your turn to ask a question now. And then the exercise would die because the child would either feel shy, or they wouldn't want to, or it wasn't fun, or something like that. But then I realized, if I put it into a game based around Q&A, and I put the questions on the cards, and part of the game is asking the question, then miraculously, suddenly they thought it was really exciting. So yeah, something like
Yeah.
that.
So you do have a series of Q&A cards, and there's the different levels. What about the
Yeah.
phonics cards that you've created also at the different levels? Like, did that come after the Q&A?
Yeah, so I sort of started one step at a time. My product's called Eigo, which in Japanese, the Japanese word for English is Eigo as well. But I spell it.
I did not know that.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. So, but I spell it AGO instead of EIGO, which is the Japanese way.
Yes.
And AGO stands for aqua, green, orange. So the AGO stands for 3 levels.
Yes. So the aqua is the level 1, the green is the
Aqua
level
level
2,
1.
and orange is level 3.
And I made the aqua Q&A game first, and I really didn't know if it was going to work or not. Everybody told me that it wasn't. People that should know, because I don't think there was any history of a EFL game really sort of selling well. I mean, my theory was that if I make the game well enough and I really spend some time in it and really get to the bottom of it, then I couldn't really see why it wouldn't work.
If I
So
just interrupt there for a minute, because I'm quite curious that you use the term EFL, English as a foreign language, and of course in Japan that's exactly what it is, whereas here in New Zealand in the industry, of course, it's ESL, where it's the second language because we are speaking English natively in the country, where we're teaching it. And I think in ESL contexts there is perhaps more of an acceptance of games in the classroom, and certainly in the places where I've taught in the past, games are very, very popular. Whereas perhaps in an EFL context, it really depends on the culture or the environment that you find yourself in. So maybe the idea that in Japan using games in the classroom wasn't so popular at the time.
yeah, maybe, but I'd say that now it's very popular.
Yeah.
And the reason is because it seems to work better. And there's a lot of teachers in Japan that have been living here since, say, the 70s or whatever, and are quite influential, and they're very big on that sort of idea. So
Right.
my sort of preconception was that, I mean, when I learned Japanese in high school, it wasn't really game focused at all, but that was a very different environment, because we'd have 30 kids in the class. I should mention I generally teach small groups of about sort of up to 8 kids.
Right. Yep.
But I've taught elementary schools as well. But obviously as far as teaching goes, there are many, many different dynamics in that.
Yeah.
Mm.
Great. So when we were talking the other day, you also mentioned, you've got the cards and you're busy selling them in Japan and in China and obviously New Zealand here. And you were saying you've also got ideas for future games in different languages. Do you want to talk about that for a little while?
Yeah, sure. So obviously I've got the English series. I think there's about 10 products in total for the English language. There's a few new ones coming out next year, level 4 of the Q&A and the phonics games. But besides that, yeah, I'm looking to get some French materials and some Spanish materials printed in the new year as well. I've already got one game in Japanese, a Q&A game, which works on the same concept.
Yeah.
Um,
And you won,
but
just
yeah,
before we go on, you actually won an award, didn't you, for these games that you've created? Is that right? Did I see some sort of
um, yeah, I
prize
was
there?
nominated for an Elton Award,
Okay, you're nominated for.
which is in the UK, and that's yeah. I mean that's I suppose the big one in the
Yep.
sort of
That's a
AI.
very high honor to, be nominated for
Yeah.
something like that. It's obviously that people have
Oh yeah.
recognized the power of a game and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So that was great. That really helped me out. That was sort of towards the beginning of it, I suppose. But it was nice to see that that people that might appreciate the finer points of language learning or language teaching saw some potential in it and liked what I was doing. So yeah, that really helped me out at the start.
Mm, mm.
Actually, but yeah, in terms of other games that I've got coming out, I don't know if I mentioned, but there might be a Maori game with a bit of luck. Fingers crossed, there might be a Maori version coming out in about a year.
Fantastic. I love the idea. Yeah.
hmm So I mean, as a Kiwi, it's something that I'm interested in pursuing, but it's not finished yet.
Awesome. And you're still teaching as well as, creating these games and spending time and, selling those. You're also still teaching now, aren't you?
I teach part-time,
hmm
and it's quite hard to create games if you're not teaching.
Yeah. You've got to be on the
You-
coal face and seeing what works and what doesn't
Yeah,
work. Yeah.
yeah, you've got to keep your skill up, and you get the best feedback from your students. I found, and I don't actually usually let them know that I make the games. They just think I'm just a teacher playing them, but I get better feedback that way. And
Like being an undercover agent.
it's not a secret or anything, but I don't always think that they know, but I imagine some of them have figured it out. But yeah, I mean, students will give you good feedback, and I think that my job pretty much is to sort of put something out there and then try and see what their reaction is to it, and you can get a lot of clues from that if you're willing to take the good with the bad.
Yes, absolutely. Got to be open to hearing that feedback, even if it's negative.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously these days I have a bunch of teachers that I get to test the games on as well, and I get feedback that way. And I mean, my method really is very much just trying to make the games as good as I can, and it takes longer that way, but I think it just works out better.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I mean, we sell your games here in New Zealand at the Resource Room, obviously, and some of my customers really love it. But what about, we may have some listeners who are listening from, say, the US or the UK or Europe. How would they be able to find your cards? Where do they go to get some?
Sure. Well, the best way is probably check out my website, which is agocards.com. So AGOCARDS.com. We have an international sales page for people that don't have local distribution.
Yep.
So New Zealand will be buying from you, but if you're in the US, you'll be directed to the US page. If you're in a country that we don't have a distributor for, you can actually buy from us, and we were able to ship it.
Great.
So, yeah, you can get it around the world, and we get customers from around the world from time to time.
Fantastic. So we're coming up towards the end of the interview, and I usually quite like to ask if there's any advice my guests have for teachers who are perhaps just starting their careers or people who are thinking they might like to be language teachers. So if you could kind of think back to your early days, what advice would you give someone in that position? Do you have 3 pieces of advice that you could share with us?
Sure. I mean, I think that the things that I like about teaching are that, I feel like I'm making a positive contribution.
Mm-hmm.
And so you feel it's something to feel good about, especially if, your kids develop or your students, be they kids or adults, if they develop a skill that they didn't have before. It's satisfying teaching children how to read. It's satisfying when they can actually sort of teach English and you sort of feel like you've played a part in that. In terms of teacher development, I'd say, yeah, just try and keep learning. It's good to speak to experienced teachers because they'll be able to give you hints.
Mm-hmm.
And figure out what you like. if you want to teach adults or you want to teach kids, are very sort of different environments, and some people have skills suited more to one or the other. And another obviously different environment is teaching business as well.
Yes.
For me, as a kids teacher, which is my specialty really, I just say, have fun with the kids and play with them and try and that for me the biggest thing that I focus on is trying to get them to interact only using English in the classroom, and it's easier said than done. I mean, especially in Japan, it might be a project that takes a year or so before they actually get it and they sort of realize that, oh, okay, I can speak in English, and now that I'm just speaking in English, it's kind of satisfying. And there are various ways to do that. Games can be a good way to get there because you can sort of not trick them, but strongly incentivize them to just start to use more and more English in the classroom. And yeah, once they do that, they're on their way.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you
Thanks,
giving us your time today and hearing all about your ventures. And no doubt we'll be talking a lot more in the future too with your games and stuff.
Thank you.
So that was Leon Butchers from Japan. I hope you enjoyed the interview. One of the things that I really appreciated was seeing how much he just learned over time. He had gone there as an opportunity to travel, ended up staying and learning from other teachers, talking about what works, learning what doesn't work, changing from one teaching environment to another till he found his niche. He decided that he loved working with children and teaching children, and he's focused on there and learned what works. So, if you are also starting out and thinking you might like to do some travel and teach a language while you're traveling, go for it. Do you need to have all the fancy training that all the career teachers get? Not necessarily. As long as you keep learning, keep talking with other teachers, figure out what's going to work for you in your classroom and your style, and just go for it. So again, if you'd like to have a look at some of the games that Leon has created, some of the English games, go to agocardgame.com. And one thing we did forget to mention in the interview is that there are actually mobile apps that go with the phonics games in particular. In Android, you can get it for free, and it's also available with iOS and the Apple system as well. If you search for AGO cards, you'll definitely find it. I think it's called Soundpad, Phonics Soundpad, and it goes with the cards. So fantastic resource. Hope you enjoyed the interview, and best of luck. Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can navigate to the show notes and links via our homepage at www.languagefuel.com. See you next time.